August 17, 1943. Camp Huntsville, Texas. The heat hit first, thick, sweet, and heavy with pine and cut grass. As the trucks rolled past the watchtower and into the compound of low, tar paper barracks and glinting chain-link fence, Gefreiter Otto Lang peered through the slats, eyes narrowed against the sun. He'd last seen it a week earlier on a Tunis dock, dimmed by coal smoke and defeat, and now it blazed white over a landscape that looked more like a farm than a prison. The trucks braked in a crunch of gravel, and a military policeman with an MP armband and a calm, practiced voice called them down by squads. The air smelled of dust, warm creosote, and something else, smoke curling from a meshal stack with the unmistakable peppered note of meat on a griddle. They moved in a column toward registration, boots thudding on planked walkways laid over the sandy soil. The barracks were long and simple, tar paper sheathing stretched tight over framing, windows propped up on sticks, screen doors slapping as men passed through with duffels and Red Cross parcels. Inside, Lang counted rows of cots with wool blankets folded hospital sharp, a pot-bellied stove squatting in the center aisle, footlockers stenciled with numbers, and a bulletin board with tidy notices in English and German about reveille, lights out, work details, and the camp orchestra's rehearsal time. Texas, said Feldwebel Kohler, the senior NCO in their group, rolling the word on his tongue with suspicion. He'd fought in Libya and Tunisia and knew dry heat. But these trees, loblolly pines, and the heavy green beyond the fence were a surprise, like waking on a ship in a lake. At the end of the barracks a small shrine had formed already, a postcard of Colne taped to a beam, a penciled list of names, a hand-drawn eagle with the edges rubbed off by someone's thumb. Outside, from the direction of the mess, a bugle sounded a cheerier call than any of them felt. They entered the chow line under a corrugated roof while GIs in aprons ladled out rations with the mechanical grace of men who'd done it 1,000 times. White enamel plates slid along, hit a puddle of mashed potatoes, a spoon of green beans, and then the line slowed briefly, 2 slices of steak falling with a soft slap beside a biscuit and pat of butter wrapped in foil. Lang held his breath. He'd eaten horse in Tunis, been hungry on the trip, and expected gray stew. The corporal behind him whispered, "Unfastbar," and didn't move until a cook jerked his chin. "Keep going." At the end of the line, a sergeant in a short-brimmed cap passed out small, neat packs from a wooden crate. Camel, Lucky Strike, Chesterfield, along with a book of matches featuring a pin-up girl whose smile felt like a prank. They sat at long tables worn smooth, the room loud with cutlery, and the low rush of fans hung from beams. The steak cut clean. Lang chewed slowly, as if it might break the spell to hurry. The coffee was bitter and strong enough to make his fingers tingle. Across from him, a GI with a scar on his jaw leaned on the counter and watched them with the wary interest you give a stray dog that looks too clean. When Lang looked up, the man lifted 2 fingers in an almost wave and went back to stacking trays. At the edge of the mess a notice board announced English classes Tuesdays and Thursdays, orchestra sign-up Saturday, and a German-language camp newspaper seeking a typesetter. That evening, in the yard between barracks, a soccer game formed with a ball made of taped rags until one of the American guards trotted up from the rec hut with a proper leather ball and a grin. Far out beyond the wire, the lights softened over rows of sorghum and the dark line of pines, insects singing so loud it sounded like a wire buzzing in the air. A guard tower cut a clean silhouette against the sky. In it, a soldier sat with his rifle across his knees and a paperback open on his lap. When the floodlights snapped on, the yard turned stage bright, but the temperature fell a notch and the men kept playing, shirts off, ribs tight against skin, laughter strange in their throats as if borrowed for an hour. After lights out, the barracks smelled of soap and sweat, and something floral drifting through the screens. Lang lay on his back and rolled the cigarette between finger and thumb, unlit, reading the label again, Lucky's, as if it were a word from a future where defeat did not mean starving. In the next cot, Kohler made a list in a small notebook: mess schedule, work detail, classes, pay coupons, Red Cross inspection next month. "They mean to impress us," he said quietly, "or to shame us." Lang didn't answer. He pressed the cigarette to his upper lip, inhaled the faint tobacco sweetness, and thought of the meal's heat, of the butter's gloss, and of the guards' two-finger greeting that did not require either of them to pretend the war was over. It felt, briefly, like standing in a doorway between two kinds of weather. Morning began with a bugle and the clunk of the pot-bellied stove's door. Someone always tried to coax flame from kindling, as if the day could be warmed faster by will. Reveille at 0545, cots made tight, boots laced, latrine scrubbed until the cement shone. The roll call took place on the packed dirt parade ground, the men arranged by barracks with NCOs taking names in clipped voices. Outside the fence line, the flatbed trucks waited for the day's work details: cotton, peanuts, lumber mills, the railroad siding. The air was already sticky, dew shining on the tall grass beyond the cleared strip. A fence gate rolled open with a squeal. The watchtower's shadow slid off the group like a long hand. On the cotton crew, Lang stood on the flatbed as it rattled past fields and small white houses with porches draped in morning glories. The free wind smelled of wet earth and something fried, and children on a fence watched the truck with the frank, unafraid gaze of small emperors. At the field, the foreman, a wiry man in a straw hat with a handkerchief around his neck, counted heads and passed out burlap sacks with a nod. No guards followed them between the rows. The furrows were soft and damp, leaves chalking their hands with dust. Lang's fingers found the rhythm fast enough, and the foreman showed him, patient as a teacher, how to twist the bowl to spare the plant. By noon, the shade under a pecan tree felt like church. The foreman's wife brought a galvanized tub of water and cups, set them down without ceremony, and left a plate of biscuits whose flour still dusted her wrists. Nobody spoke at first. Then a Spanish word or two passed between the migrant boys and the Germans, drifted into laughter that made the foreman smile before he remembered not to. Back in camp, the afternoon was for repairs, mending uniforms, cutting new shelves for the footlockers from scrap wood, writing letters. The camp post issued the thin blue aerograms that tasted of sizing on your tongue when you licked the flap. Pens scratched in uneasy German, trying to explain Texas without making it sound like a vacation. Lang wrote to his mother about the trees and the food and the orchestra he had heard warming up in the recreation hut. A clarinet trying scales, a violin finding its voice, a piano in need of tuning. He did not describe the way the guard sometimes looked like a neighbor waiting for rain. He did not write about the cigarette on his lip with the label that called him lucky. At 1600, Lang crossed to the rec hut with his clarinet case under his arm. He had not played since a church festival near Castle 2 summers before, and the smell of cork grease and old felt hit him like a hand on the shoulder. The orchestra's conductor, a former music teacher with careful hair and a steady, kind impatience, tapped the stand. They read a march first, something to line the lungs, and then, because the piano could manage it, and because the violinist had the nerve, they tripped into a Schubert waltz that made the room feel briefly cooler. Outside the screens, a few GIs leaned on the sill and listened, their faces at rest in a way that did not belong to war. When the piece ended, one of the Americans clapped softly with the backs of his fingers against the screen frame, embarrassed by his own pleasure. In the evenings, classes. English words written in chalk on a board. Window, fence, field, neighbor, wage. Then verbs. Earn, mend, listen, change. A young schoolteacher from town came in twice a week with books from the public library and a patience that made Kohler suspicious until she gave him a grammar exercise he could not finish in 10 minutes. At a table near the back, the camp chaplain ran a small reading group, the men bending over pages like men around a game of cards. The camp newspaper recruited a typesetter and hand-inked a masthead with a little flourish in the G that the editor loved like a pet. Inspections came with a hush, a Swiss armband at the front gate, notebooks, questions asked politely in several languages. Barracks walked with heads bent to examine sheets and stoves and rations lists. Kohler smartened the men like a parade, barked at a crooked blanket hospital corner, and later, when the inspectors were gone and the barracks hummed with the relief that follows a test, he leaned his chair back and lit one of his cigarettes with the same rituals he'd practiced in the desert. "They will send this back to the Reich," he said. "They will tell them we are fed like farmhands and taught like schoolboys." He didn't say the next thought out loud, that his cousin, captured near Smolensk, had written once from a camp with no heat, and then never again. By September's first cool night, The soccer pitch had lines chalked with ground gypsum, and the goal mouth sagged with rope. WWII had scrounged from the depot. A game against the guards happened almost by accident, shirts versus skins, and the laughter that followed a clean nutmeg felt like something owed, finally paid. Afterward, the guards sat on the stoop of the mess with the prisoners, passing a tin pail of ice and bottles that sweated and ticked in the heat. A corporal told a story about a rattlesnake under the stoop that made the Germans yelp and then laugh. One of the prisoners tried the word rattle with his mouth, pleased by the click of it. Lang walked back to the barracks in the insect roar and the sawtooth rhythm of the night train far off, thinking of the foreman's biscuits, of the Schubert waltz, of the guard's quick feet, and the way the ball lifted off his instep like a little miracle. He had been taught to expect cruelty and found curiosity. He had been told to be hard and discovered that some kinds of hardness snap in heat, while others bend and return to shape. At lights out, he tucked the English word neighbor inside the German for fence and watched them sit together in the dark like men who had been asked to play a duet. The camp was not a postcard. Friction ran like a crack under the varnish. In Barracks 12, a sergeant with old loyalties tacked up a newspaper clipping with a face that made half the room stiffen and the other half look at the floor. Kohler took it down and folded it once, twice, until the paper was a small hard thing in his hand. Discipline, he said, and meant something larger than barracks order. A week later, an argument over the orchestra's choice of a spiritual, brought in by the chaplain, turned loud enough to bring a guard to the door. It ended with a compromise, Brahms on Wednesday, the spiritual on Friday, both played like they mattered. Outside, Texan eyes watched all this with a mixture of pity, curiosity, and sourness that sometimes curdled into complaint. At the grocery, Lang and the work crew's foreman stood in line behind a woman with ration books worn soft at the edges. She stared at the POWs lunch pail and the way the foreman had slipped an extra biscuit inside. Fritz Ritz, someone muttered, an old nickname now fitted with new resentment. The foreman didn't look up. Geneva, he said to nobody, as if the word could serve as a receipt for the woman to take home to her empty shelf. Lang learned not to meet certain eyes, learned that comfort can be a kind of insult if measured against someone else's hunger. Letters came back thin and late. From Kassel, Lang's mother wrote of clouds that did not move and a sky that burned without sun. She asked, very carefully between lines, if her son had enough to eat, as if such a question could be asked without cutting both ways. He answered with descriptions of work and classes and the orchestra. He did not name the steak or the cigarettes. On Sundays he stood in a chapel that had once been a supply shed and sang the parts he remembered from home. The hymn's words stretched between languages like ropes across a river. There were escapes. Mostly they were short, almost whimsical. A boy who ducked under a fence and walked to the edge of the river to see if the stars were different there. A trio who built a raft out of oil drums and rope and were found 3 bins downstream waving at fishermen. One who rode a laundry truck as far as the crossroads and jumped off to sit under a live oak until a deputy found him pretending to be lost. The guards took statements and wrote them up on pre-printed forms. The men got 30 days of confinement and a new caution around the edges of their laughter. Inspections returned, and the Red Cross man, a Swiss with neat hair and careful shoes, sat at a table in the mess and listened to grievances about soap rations and the orchestra's sheet music, nodding as if such things were the exact weight of justice. He toured the infirmary where an American nurse with forearms like a plow horse's wrists changed a dressing on a bayonet wound that had finally, after months of salt and heat, decided to heal. Better than the field hospital at Sidi Bouzid, the patient said, and the nurse smiled without warmth. It isn't a competition, honey. Autumn worked itself into the pines and made evenings almost cool. The fields went as sorghum and peanuts. The work crews took to the peanut rows with the same steady rhythm they'd learned in cotton, and the farmers' kids taught Lang how to crack a raw peanut with his teeth and not shatter the kernel. He taught them a counting game from school and found himself laughing with a girl in a gingham dress whose missing front tooth made every S a soft th. On the ride back, the truck passed a church picnic on a field, and a woman held up a pie with both hands to keep it level. The truckload of POWs hooped at the sight, and the woman laughed and lifted the pie like a toast. That night the orchestra played a march for the camp commandant's inspection, and then, with a look from the conductor to the chaplain and back, the spiritual. The Americans at the back of the hall sang the chorus softly. The Germans found the harmony without being told. Kohler stood at the end of the row, hands tight on the back of a chair, and let the sound move through him until something in his jaw loosened. After lights, Lang sat on the steps of the barracks and smoked one of the precious cigarettes, one hand cupped over the ember. The insect song sawed at the edges of the night like a familiar tool. He thought of the foreman's wife with flour on her wrists, of the nurse's flat voice, of the girl with the th in her smile, and of his mother holding a ration card with scissors poised. He exhaled and watched the smoke unravel, thought of Geneva as a kind of recipe, measured portions, proper heat, and wondered if the men who wrote it had ever stood this far from home and felt their enemy hand them a cup of water. He flicked ash and considered, for the first time with no anger in it, what the word neighbor meant when the fence is not a line you drew yourself. Winter rewrote the air with a thin brightness that made the pines smell sharper and the sky feel higher. The mess served stew more often, still hot and peppered, with cornbread that broke in clean squares. The orchestra moved indoors for good, and the chaplain's reading circle took up a novel where the hero's courage had nothing to do with uniforms. Work shifted to the rail siding and the lumber mill. Lang learned to ride a dolly and steer a stack of ties with his hip. The guard on that detail, a black GI with a baritone laugh, taught him a verse of a song and then took him, one steady noun at a time, through the English word for every tool in his hands. On the way back, they sat on opposite sides of the truck, and the guard, staring at a cafe where a sign on the door spelled a word Lang did not understand, chewed the inside of his cheek like a man biting down on a bad memory. A rumor moved like wind. Iwo, then Okinawa, then Manila, names on the chalkboard under news that lengthened the shadow of the calendar. The Red Cross visit came with a clipboard and talk of repatriation schedules that sounded like someone else's plans. Kohler doubled the English classes, grumbling that the men let their articles wander like goats. The teacher only smiled and circled their mistakes with a neat hand and a patience that should have grown old and never did. Spring lifted the fence's hum into a brighter register. On an April afternoon, the camp baseball diamond took over from the soccer pitch, bats cracked, and a German teenager with a runner's legs learned to steal second, while a private from Kansas shouted useless advice. The sound belonged to a place where war was a headline and not a smell in your clothes. That evening, Lang sat at the table with a stack of pay coupons and a list, razor blades, a bar of soap that smelled like lemon, a tin of pipe tobacco for Kohler, 2 postcards, a pencil. He added a chocolate bar for the foreman's girl and drew a small box around it, as if to protect it from subtraction. The gate swung both ways that summer. A convoy of returning GIs passed the camp and honked. A truck brought a new batch of prisoners, thin boys with pale hair and a look that said the ground had moved under them too many times to trust it. The camp took them in with the efficiency of a well-run farm. Cots, towels, a spoon, a bowl, a lecture on rules, a reminder that the orchestra rehearsed Tuesdays, and that the newspaper wanted someone who could set type in a straight line. At night, Lang found one of the new boys sitting on the barracks steps with his hands flat on his thighs, staring at the dark as if it might write him a new page. "Steak?" the boy said, half mocking, half pleading. Lang nodded toward the mess, where the late shift was mopping and the smell from the grill hung sweet and real. "Sometimes," he said. "And cigarettes." The boy laughed without humor and then, as if the sound startled him, laughed again for real. When the end came into view, it arrived not as trumpets, but as schedules, names on lists, trains to the port, lectures about conduct on ships, about what to say and not say, about the papers each man would carry that would not stop a neighbor's suspicion or buy a loaf of bread. The orchestra planned a final concert, and the chaplain offered a benediction in 2 languages that left both rooms quiet. The foreman came to the gate and held out a paper sack to Lang. Biscuits, 2 peaches wrapped like eggs in newspaper, a small jar of something that turned out to be fig preserves. "For your mother," he said, and Lang understood that some gifts cross borders more faithfully than letters. On the last evening, the camp smelled again of cut grass and hot creosote. The floodlights blew small halos in the thinning insects. Kohler opened his notebook to the first page and read the list he had made the night they arrived. He closed it, and slipped it into the footlocker he would not carry any farther than the depot. "I thought they meant to shame us," he said, "or to impress us." He shook his head. "Perhaps they meant only to keep an agreement. And perhaps that is enough to change a man." Morning found the barracks neat as receipts. The truck idled. The gate stood open in the same way it had stood closed, plainly, without theater. As Lang climbed aboard, he looked at the tower and at the guard with the paperback, at the mess window with its wire screen, at the wreck hut where the last notes of the waltz were still faint in the boards if you put your ear to them. He held the paper sack carefully and felt, through the thin walls of the peaches, the shape of a place that had not been home, but had nonetheless taught him how to leave one. On the road to the railhead, the truck passed a field where the foreman's girl waved with her whole arm and shouted a word he had taught her and that she had improved. "Neighbor." She put her hand to her mouth and laughed at the sound of it. He answered with the best English he had, calling it back across the ditch and the fence and the space between what he had been and what he was going to be.